Hello and welcome to today's podcast episode on mitigating cyber threats in Asia, leveraging threat-informed defense. I'm Gaurav, your host and moderator for this session of EnsiderVoices, our podcast. Today we're going to be diving into an interesting topic that's both crucial and timely, the unique cyber threat landscape in Asia and how it contrasts with what we see perhaps in other parts of the world. We'll be discussing the importance of assessing our threat adversaries and how organizations can enhance their cyber defense strategies. We have two fantastic guests today, Mike Cunningham from the MITRE Engenuity Center for Threat-Informed Defense. Mike brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in threat-informed defense, and he'll be sharing his insights on how this approach can lead to a more comprehensive and effective cyber defense strategy. And I'll get him to introduce himself in a little bit. Joining Mike, we have myself, Gaurav. So I'm the head of advisory and emerging business here at Ensign Infosecurity. And we've got Mr. Teo Xiang Zheng. He'll be introducing himself as well. So together, all of us will be exploring the various aspects of Asia's threat context, the efficacy of threat detection techniques, and how to decipher cybersecurity scoring and benchmarking, and perhaps even understanding how the MITRE ATT&CK framework could be used for strategic, tactical, and operational cybersecurity outcomes. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. Mike, could you start by first giving us a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Mike Cunningham. I'm the R&D Program Manager at the Center for Threat-Informed Defense. And with my job, I'm focused on advancing the state of the art and the state of the practice in threat-informed defense. It helps us better understand our adversaries so that way we can better defend against them. And with that, I partner with great organizations such as Ensign to solve hard research problems that otherwise couldn't be solved individually. So we really take a community-focused effort on being able to tackle some of the hardest problems we see in cybersecurity today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. And thank you once again for joining us. I appreciate that it's a big time difference for all of us. XC, over to you. Maybe a quick introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'm Xiang Zheng, the VP of Advisory. And basically, I've been in Ensign since the beginning and also a key contributor to the recent Cyber Threat Landscape Report 2024, of which I think much of the topics we will be discussing will cover some of them. Other aspects is I'm an executive advisor to board members and C-suite members of organizations, really helping them navigate the cyber risks and also helping them and implement cyber strategies so as to be able to better manage them. In the course of our work, we do a whole gamut of activities in terms of understanding the threat profiles the organizations are exposed to, their landscape, and really kind of align to the threat-informed defense approach, right fitting or fit for purpose analysis of what kinds of defense implementations they should actually be looking at, and the kind of concepts of defense that they should actually be applying. So I'm really excited that we have Mike here to join us, and I think we will be discussing some of those approaches together.
Excellent. And yes, we are going to be looking forward to that conversation. But let's start at the very start. Here at Ensign, we're big fans of threat-informed defense. It influences almost everything we do, from advisory, designing, building, operating, and even incident response. So threat-informed defense permeates our organization. But maybe not everybody's familiar with what it means. So Mike, maybe tell us a little bit about, what is threat-informed defense and what are some of the primary objectives of MITRE's Engenuity CTID?
Yeah, so for us, threat-informed defense really relies on three main pillars. We have cyber threat intelligence, we have defensive measures, and then we have test and evaluation. And that's really a cyclical process. And so you need to be doing each one to help feed the other. And so the more that we can understand our adversary through cyber threat intelligence, we can then inform our defensive measures. And then once we have those defensive measures, we can test against them, evaluate. And when we get those results, we can then feed that back into our threat intelligence. And so that's our threat-informed defense cycle. We really apply that to any adversary that we might be tracking. And the reason we're focusing specifically on adversaries and the threat, as opposed to theoretical or hypothetical situations, is because that's where we find the most results, and we can focus on realistic situations as opposed to lab-built testing and maybe really cool hacks or red team assessments that someone might have, but aren't really seen in practice. And so when we know the threat, and especially when we're speaking, of the Asian landscape, that might be a different threat than we see in America or in Europe. And so we really want to focus on the threat that's coming after our specific organization. And the more that we understand that threat, the more we can inform our defenses.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. Eggsy, what does it mean for Ensign? What is Ensign's interest in doing threat-informed defense, and how do we kind of apply it?
So Ensign began almost 6 years ago today. And essentially, one of the key reasons why we embarked on a threat-informed defense approach for all our service offerings is we understand that the landscape in terms of industry players that are out there, many times they are coming from textbook approaches in terms of understanding what's the exposure that they are going through. And it tends to lean towards a comprehensive coverage of the compliance requirements or control space. And what we now know as cybersecurity practitioners is that being 100% compliant may not mean that you are fully defended, well defended against the adversary, because the adversary continuously evolves. They change their practices, their behaviors, as well as the toolkits. And kind of the compliance lens holds a standard line that doesn't evolve with those changes. So applying a threat-informed defense approach for us really helps us contextualize the operational and strategic defenses that an organization needs to have, particularly in terms of the types of mitigations as highlighted by Mike earlier, the defensive actions. And it also leads to a more proactive journey that organizations can take, particularly if embedding other MITRE good resources, for example, MITRE Engage, MITRE Defend, which are more proactive defensive measures, for example, deception techniques and so on, that organizations who are far ahead in terms of the maturity curve could consider. So it actually leads to a very nice progression in terms of if there's cyber hygiene or compliance baseline already met, what's the next level? Let's go to operational efficacy, which the threat-informed defense allows that evolutionary pathway. And then even further, if we push beyond just MITRE ATT&CK and look towards proactive defensive measures, deception, for example, that's been highlighted in Engage framework, those will allow a more evolutionary pathway that organizations can aspire towards. So it's no longer a kind of something that's very obvious in Asia, which is a national exam. There's no 100 marks means you're at the best. Even if you're at the best, what does that mean in the face of an adversary? So the threat-informed defense approach allows us to be able to then measure ourselves. That goes to the third point that Mike highlighted, evaluate ourselves against known adversaries that are more likely to be targeting us. Their known behaviors, their known techniques, their known toolkits. That gives you a good sense and confidence in terms of determining your defensive measures against them. So bringing all that back together is not just looking at the way we onboard a client, but also in terms of the continual access to understand where their threat landscape is actually evolving. How does that change from an Ensign perspective? The types of technology solutions or cybersecurity solutions that we actually advocate for them, how we might configure, arrange, integrate those solutions together to address the threats that they face. That would be systems integration. From our managed security services standpoint, then it is really allowing our analysts to understand the change in the landscape that's going at the operational level and how to adjust so that they best meet the threat levels that they are facing. And coming from our consulting and advisory lenses, for our consulting colleagues, it really is about understanding what kind of attack scenarios that they should be emulating through their threat hunts, through their red team exercises, or maybe paying special attention to in their vulnerability and penetration tests. At an advisory perspective, because we use the threat-informed defense approach for strategic purposes, that is really to understanding in the 3-year, 5-year horizon, what kind of threats should they be preparing themselves for, and what kind of new defense concept of operations they should be laying out. So that really kind of brings everything together from an Ensign offerings standpoint. And that's why at the core, we leverage the threat-informed defense so much.
We can use threat-informed defense, and plenty of organizations do refer to the MITRE ATT&CK framework just for that level of understanding. Mike, want to hear from you. What's the difference between a company that just uses the MITRE framework versus one that's a research sponsor? What does a research sponsor mean?
So a research sponsor is someone that's contributing to building this knowledge base. And so with ATT&CK, with CTID, we're a community-based organization. And so when we partner up with these research partners, they are sharing their knowledge that they've gained in their local area of operations or their global area of operations. And they're really helping us build that knowledge base. Without having the research sponsors to help us with our work, like we wouldn't be anywhere. We exist because of them and for them. And so when we can team up with different organizations, different research sponsors, it really helps us expand the reach that we can have, not just the network that we have, but also the knowledge that we have. And so we bring in people from organizations who might have AI knowledge, they might have machine learning, they might be defensive operations specialists, red teamers. We can bring in all these different experts from different areas and join forces to make one great team that's greater than the sum of its parts. And so really our research sponsors are at the core of what we do and what our community is trying to accomplish. Because our adversaries are never ending. They have unlimited resources as well. They're going to constantly come after us. And so if we don't do this work together, we're never going to be able to stop them.
To add on, Ensign joining as a research sponsor for the Center for Threat and Informed Defense really is to be able to be a lens and contribution coming from Asia, because clearly we see that in terms of the sponsorship participation, Asia is not as well represented when we started. Clearly, with our joining, more Asian representatives have now also participated in the Center for Threat Informed Defense research initiatives. So that's really good stuff. And the key point why we are doing it is that, one, contribute our insights and knowledge, two, be able to participate in a larger community, as Mike, you've highlighted earlier, to be able to then trade and share ideas and be able to develop innovative outcomes and knowledge that can be shared internationally, and really bringing a lens that is a bit more balanced, covering a much more broader international and global lens.
From both of your comments, it really sounds like the purpose of using this is to understand, not just understand your threats, but understand your client and understand what works, what controls are effective, what controls are necessary. But this idea of understanding also has a geographical element. And Eggsy, you shared that Asia's context is a little bit different. Tell us a little bit more about that. How does the cybersecurity threat landscape in Asia differ from what you might be seeing in Europe and the US, particularly in terms of observed attack techniques and adversary behavior?
So in Asia, we see a lot of first and foremost, let's go towards the nature of Asia, right? We are multicultural, we are multilinguistic in nature. There are many different ethnic groups that operate with or are present in Asia. And therein lies unique cultures and behaviors that are not seen in Western territories. Given that context, and is also reported in our recent threat landscape report, hacktivism has actually been on the rise, spurred predominantly by the Israel-Hamas conflict that happened at the cusp of the end of last year. And it has actually transited into this year as well. And what we are seeing is that there are a lot of activist groups that have actually matured themselves, learning from what was already observed in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Notably, for example, Bjorka has taken a very individualistic, self-oriented mission to try and educate the Indonesian public as well as the government that cybersecurity is not something to be belittled, and that more investments and attention should be paid there. We look at two other hacktivist groups, Dragon Force Malaysia as well as GhostSec, that have actually expressed interest and have also demonstrated new capabilities to participate in the ransomware as a service route. And that's a major leap for a hacktivist group to go beyond just creating disruption, but also having a means of gaining funds to enrich themselves as well as to develop further capabilities. So that's one unique element that we are seeing. Of course, the motivations behind these hacktivist groups are unique in nature. Dragon Force Malaysia as well as GoSec have been oriented towards their causes aligned with the Israel-Hamas conflict, whereas Bjorka is more towards educating the public as he or she claims to do so. So that's one unique perspective, and I think why I highlighted and started off with hacktivists is that the nature of proxy groups acting in alignment with other larger state-related activities or initiatives could provide quite a murky space for first and foremost threat intelligence analysts to really discern whether or attribute whether the activities are driven by a non-state activity, non-state actor, or cyber criminal or organized crime groups, that kind of nature. So therein lies another lens when we look towards and most recently widely discussed, which is cyber insurance, where cyber insurers are also now starting to determine that if it can be attributed to a state-sponsored activity, then it might be leaning on the fine print relating towards the acts of war, of which there might not be much coverage aligned to it. So how does that murkiness actually bolster well for the insured? Those are parts of the challenges that I think will come from an Asian lens predominantly, but also I know the West is also struggling with some of these questions at hand.
Actually, that's an interesting observation about the rise of hacktivism and the changing nature of it. Mike, are you seeing some of this in the West as well? Is it still just generally ransomware? Or are we starting to see an evolution in the type of adversaries and the type of tactics that they're using?
So we're definitely seeing some evolution in the type of techniques, especially as ransomware is moving away from just encrypt your data to now extortion. But something that we like to focus on in the Center for Threat Informed Defense is partnering with different regions, and specifically Asia Pacific region, because we're not the experts in that area. We like to partner with organizations like Ensign to help us better understand the problem set that you guys and your customers are facing. And then with that, we can team up with our European partners, our American partners, South American partners to really help create a solution that can affect positively each of those different regions. And so when we look at the problem set that we're facing, we can see specifically how either the hacktivists, the ransomware actors are operating in that specific area of operations. And then we can try to design solutions to help combat those specific use cases. And sometimes those overlap with each other, but sometimes they're very specific. And so we want to make sure that we have a solution for any area, for any of the communities. And that's why partnering with different regions is very important to us and critical to the success that we have.
Thanks. I guess there's so many ways in which you can use and implement the cybersecurity frameworks like ATT&CK. Maybe, Mike, for organizations in Asia that are looking to try this out, what would you suggest as some effective ways to try and implement and put them into practice?
Whichever framework that you're going to use, and we'll just use ATT&CK as a reference, you just have to start with one technique. So pick a technique that might be important to you or your organization and focus on that one first, just by itself. Because ATT&CK has over 500 techniques and sub-techniques. And if you try to take everything in at once, it's going to be a challenging, daunting, mostly impossible task. But if we break each technique down one by one, then we could focus specifically on what is this technique doing? What are the data sources I need to detect this technique? And then you can start working through each one bit by bit and start building out your coverage, your heat map that you might be looking for. And this could be with ATT&CK, with Engage, as you mentioned, with Defend, any of the frameworks that might be out there. You really got to start incrementally. Don't try to tackle the whole beast at once. Because again, that's going to be a fool's errand and you won't be able to accomplish that.
I like to just add on to what Mike highlighted earlier. So at Ensign, when we do our threat profiling for our clients, similar to what Mike highlighted, we profile our clients based on the business activities that they participate in, as well as the territorial coverage that they are exposed to. From there, we will narrow down a set of threat groups that are most likely relevant to them. And when we amalgamate the techniques together, the heat map will essentially give us a picture which is how many threat groups in that filtered set use a particular technique against an organization like our client. Therein has a score to a particular technique, which we can then use to prioritize the kind of defensive actions that we want to take, whether it is implementation of mitigation solutions, process or technology, or implementing better detection rules so that we can see across the coverage more meaningfully. Now, going a little bit of detail there, the higher concentration or higher numbers in a particular technique will mean that it is as common as possible across the filtered set of threat groups that we've identified. But there will be also outliers that are maybe one threat actor is using that technique. Now, we don't advocate that you kind of ignore those, but rather pay attention to the threat actor that is most dangerous to you. So, for example, Vault Typhoon has been something that's quite widely mentioned across the world. Their ability to sleep in an organization for a very long period of time, largely to monitor and gather information about the operations. Now, if that threat group and its techniques are most of concern to our client, then that's where we would evaluate the comprehensiveness of their coverage, both from an implementation of processes and technologies, as well as the detection capabilities, whether do they cover that whole gamut. So that therein lies an opportunity to filter and prioritize what kind of actions that you take as a cyber defender.
And can I dive into that a little bit more? So you keep talking about coverage of this detection technique. Could you unpack that a little bit? What do you need in order to understand whether it's sufficient and whether it's effective, whether that coverage has enough data behind it? What kind of information are you looking for when you engage a client on that?
I will start first, but of course, Mike, please feel free to reinforce any key concepts. The first thing, starting with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, if you identify an adversarial technique, there are already mapped out detection sources that you should have. That is the starting point in terms of understanding how many detection sources do you need to implement to cover or to monitor that particular adversarial technique. Therein lies additional details that we sometimes go beyond what attack describes, and that's really leveraging our cyber practitioners' know-how. For example, understanding in a particular operating system or the platform, what kind of similar logs are required to be able to achieve that detection source objective. So in Windows, for example, you have your security logs, you have your operating system audit trail, and things like that. Would those two be sufficient to meet a particular detection source objective? That is something that we will apply our practitioners' know-how. And maybe that doesn't exist. The audit trail logs as well as the security logs don't exist for another platform. Maybe that is in the Internet of Things device. Maybe that's a Linux-oriented solution. We will then do adjacency mapping for our clients to be able to understand what that is. So step one is understanding whether for a particular adversary technique, you've got all the detection sources in play, which is advocated by the attack mapping process. The second part is then evaluating how rich is that data source. Does it provide all the granular details that you would require? So at Ensign, we apply almost a digital forensic investigator's lens in terms of if an incident were to happen along the lines of this particular adversary technique, what kinds of additional artifacts do we need to collect so as to be able to triage and determine the root cause? So therein might be additional details that don't come from an attack immediate mapping of the detection sources, but we apply those processes there. I'll let Mike reinforce with any additional details there as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree with the data sources component. You have to understand your logging, what you're actually collecting, and then which event IDs actually pair up with each of those data sources. We've done some research on that called sensor mappings to attack. where we align a lot of different sensor data, so Windows Event ID, Sysmon, CloudTrail, Audit-D, and align them with specific attack data sources. And as you mentioned, that's the foundation of being able to assess your coverage. And then the next thing that I like to focus on is the different procedures within each technique. So if we take scheduled task, for instance, you might have a detection in a data source to collect the execution of sctas.exe, which is the native binary in Windows to execute a scheduled task. However, you're missing out on the PowerShell implementation of scheduled task and the registry add for scheduled task. And so understanding each of the techniques and the different procedures, you can't rely on just saying, I have coverage for this one technique because we have one instantiation of it. You need to make sure you understand the different procedures and do you have detections for each of those procedures. And so if we go back to taking one technique at a time for our detections, we can then, once we see one technique, find out the different procedures, the data sources that are associated with that, and then look at the richness of our logs, as Xe mentioned, to determine if we can actually detect not just the technique, but all the implementations of that technique.
One other aspect of considering might be the attack flow as well, which is going towards the evaluation angle of the threat informed defense approach. So I think attack flow leveraging these concepts that have already been tied down in the attack framework, the adversarial technique, the detection, the procedures, as well as the mitigations. The attack flow will then stitch out what a typical campaign for a known threat group may actually lay out in sequence and be able to support threat hunters or even red teamers to execute a plan. That actually reinforces the assessment for an organization in terms of how defendable they are against such an attack flow. So I think I may not be doing justice to attack flow, but Mike, if you have more information there.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up attack flow. And the core tenet of attack flow is that it's not just one data point that we're looking at. So again, if we see scheduled task, well, an administrator in your network could be doing scheduled tasks as part of their regular duties. But when you start chaining together techniques, so we see scheduled task, then we see memory access, then we see lateral movement. Once we start chaining all those behaviors together, we have a pretty good idea that this is malicious and it's not benign activity. And so attack flow is a great way that you can visualize that and chain together these different techniques to get a full picture of the attack and of the behaviors of the adversary.
Thanks. And I'm loving the fact that we're now discussing how it works in context and how it works in implementation in an actual organization to use it to detect and hopefully stop the adversary from successfully breaching the company. How else can we harness this MITRE ATT&CK framework for strategic, tactical, and even operational cybersecurity outcomes? How flexible is this framework to address technical and perhaps even non-technical cybersecurity challenges? Mike, maybe we start with you.
So attack can be used by a variety of different practitioners. And I don't want to say technical or non-technical. It just depends on the type of information that you need. And so if you're higher level management, you might just need the why of the attacker. So that would be the tactic. We can look at credential access. So that's like what they were trying to do. We know the attacker was trying to get credentials. If you're a tier 1 or a tier 2 analyst, you might need to know the technique information. And so that's LSAS memory access, for instance. They're getting credentials through LSAS. If you're a tier 3, maybe you need to know the specific procedures of how they were doing that. So were they using Mimikatz? Were they using ProcDump? So attack is very flexible. It has levels for all the different types of information that you might need. And depending on who you're trying to communicate with, that's the way the language is common enough that you can use it in a way that all audience should be able to understand it.
Thanks so much. Xe, what are the opportunities or I guess the advantages of applying this MITRE ATT&CK framework, not just for technical implementation, but really trying to frame the language of strategy and operations for an organization using that framework?
I'll start off with what is a bad example of how to implement cybersecurity defensive concept operations. You take a framework like attack, and your goal as an organization is to implement the 100% of all the defensive measures, the detection sources, and the procedures that you are observing in the attack framework. And it is an impossible task. My
And very
conversations with
expensive
leaders,
task.
exactly, it's an exponentially expensive task that they will go through. With the context that we have insufficient talent pool in the ecosystem, there's not enough budget to go around, and so on and so forth. So that's the bad example. But what's the right example? And we see that beauty of applying the threat informed defense here in Ensign is if you contextualize the threat that you are most likely to face, you are better able to invest your limited resources towards having a good defense posture that will address the majority of the threats that you will face as an organization. So this really echoes back to kind of Sun Tzu, where he has famously said, if you know the enemy, you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles because you will win more likely than lose. So first, by contextualizing the threat environment, you determine, and this is already mapped out in the attack framework, you determine what are the kinds of detection procedures and the data sources that you need to have, as well as the mitigations that you need to implement to be able to face this set of the threat landscape. Now, in that, from a few angles, as a leader or executive in an organization, I will want to determine what my return on security investments will look like. One part would be then to use the implementations that have been the mitigations that have been mapped out by the adversarial techniques that I see relevant to me, and see how much of it have I implemented. So this could come from a network architecture review perspective to just see, have I got adequate technical controls that have been implemented? And this could come from hardening of my assets. It could come from implementing of critical cybersecurity solutions, whether it's firewall, it's IDPSs, or intrusion detection solutions, and so on and so forth. From there, I know where my gap is, and I have a very clean example to seek for budget in terms of closing types of threats. Note that I highlighted earlier also that if I perform a threat landscape and I've generated a heat map in terms of the adversarial techniques, I can then connect this gap towards the number of threat actors that are using this particular technique to come at me, and how useful this mitigation would be, thereby answering the return on security investment, or ROSI, that I mentioned earlier. Similarly, I have a sprawling cyber threat sprawling asset space or digital attack surface. Using the detection sources that have been mapped out, I can then say how much of my digital attack surface am I actually monitoring, and where are the gaps that I'm not seeing. This then directly translates towards the kind of impact, maybe exfiltration and command and control. I'm referring to the tactics highlighted in the attack framework that I might be concerned about that I'm not necessarily paying attention to. Therein lies another gap indicator that I can then bring towards the budgeting exercise to then say, this is what we would need to do to be able, and this is what we need to spend so as to be able to bring us there. Now, clearly it's an evolving landscape, and just because you have more mitigations or more detection sources than what your heat map does for you doesn't necessarily mean that you scale back, but you know you're in a better off position. So at least this comes with an informed space, and we echo the threat informed defense approach once again. Informed space for leaders and decision makers to then understand what they are actually spending and investing themselves towards. There is a goal in mind rather than an impossible task, as I said, the bad example, which is this is a framework I implement the 100% of whatever is in there, and they will find themselves digging too deep beyond making business sense.
No, agreed fully. Trying to defend against everything, everywhere, all at once is a fruitless, painful task. But I think the two words that stood out for me for this whole conversation is understanding and prioritizing. Understanding what's out there, understanding what's inside, and then prioritizing what to do about it. I want to ask both of you, before we end off, to share kind of one last suggestion For cyber practitioners who are listening in and new to this whole concept of threat-informed defense, how can they get started? What would you recommend that they do about it? Maybe we start with Mike.
Yeah, so going back to what XE said, or Sun Tzu, know yourself. And that gets used a lot in this community, but it's really critical. Know what is important to you. What assets are you most focused on? Is it your web servers, your email clients, your endpoints? Understanding that, then you can understand the threat that's going to come after those specific assets. And maybe you have posts on your network that you haven't touched in years and you don't even know exist. Can you provide a network map of your organization? A lot of people don't do that. They don't know what that even is. And so you have vulnerable assets sitting out there that are unmanaged. And so really understanding not just what your assets are, what your network is, but what's a priority to you. We've talked a lot about budget and prioritizing different detections. You have to determine as an organization what is most important to you to protect, to defend against. And then once you've understood that and you have a good idea of your organization as a whole, then you can start to focus on the enemy and who's going to be coming after you, those assets, your operations. And so really understanding yourself has to be completed before you can move on to more advanced of threat-informed defense, or getting into specifically the APTs that are coming after me. Because if you don't know who you are, you don't know who's going to be targeting you based off of their modus operandi.
Thanks so much, Mike. XZ, any final thoughts to share with cyber practitioners?
I'll come with a slightly different angle. Much of the market always speaks about risk-informed approaches towards dealing with cybersecurity. And we see more often than not that the risk-informed approach that has been practiced comes from textbook analysis. Not that there is no space for that, but it is done in isolation of understanding what the kind of threat landscape that they're operating in. And sometimes we see that some threat aspects do not translate into risks, even though they are, as an organization, exposed to them. So we would really advocate that there is an appreciation of the threats and the organization is exposed to, and then re-evaluate what kind of risks that they are actually preparing themselves for, and hopefully be able to use some elements of the mitigations, detection sources, and procedures highlighted in the attack framework in consideration about how they would lay out their risk mitigation approaches. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of direct application of TID, I think that's going back to how Ensign has invested ourselves into annual threat landscape report writing, where we not only provide a view in terms of each unique territory, what are the kinds of adversarial techniques they are observing, but also mapping out useful defensive mitigation as well as detection actions that they need to be laying out. Now, if it is too difficult, we've also done the executive summaries to be able to give broad line topics that leaders need to pay attention to and really have those fixated at their board meetings or their executives meetings so that they can already start using the benefits coming out from a threat-informed approach. Now, of course, if they want tailored approaches, exactly what we've been discussing in this whole podcast, they can try to apply some of the concepts that threat-informed defense led by CITID at the MITRE Engenuity to be able to begin their own process, or work with cyber practitioners that are already advocating it, for example, like Ensign.
Excellent. Well, that concludes Insider Voices podcast episode on mitigating cyber threats in Asia, leveraging threat-informed defense. I really want to thank both our guests, Mike Cunningham and Teo Xiang Zheng, for their valuable insights. We've discussed the unique cyber threat landscape in Asia, the application of MITRE ATT&CK, and the importance of moving beyond compliance to a more holistic approach to cybersecurity. As both of them have said, know yourself, know your enemy, and hopefully it helps you stay safe online. To our listeners, we hope you found this episode informative and useful for enhancing your cybersecurity strategies. Thank you so much for joining us.